Study Committee. And tonight's hearing is on a surveillance technology called body-worn cameras, which is being considered for deployment here in Brookline. And of course, is the rage across the country. But we wanted to make sure that before we go down the road to deploy body-worn cameras, that we have a discussion in town that will inform the select board, the police department, the police union, and others who will be involved with the negotiation of the terms and conditions of any deployment of body-worn cameras. There are a lot of issues here that if we don't talk about early on in the process, we'll have to catch up with, and it'll be very difficult later on. So what we've done is to put together what we call a body-worn camera considerations for Brookline document. And I hope everyone has read that. It's not any, it's not a conclusory document. It's just a list of issues that we think people need to think about and that the town will need to think about as we go down this road. So the hearing is hopefully will provoke people to give their views, pro or con or indifferent, or still coming up with their views on body-worn cameras. So what I'd like to do to begin with is to have members of our committee, which is comprised of a lot of people with incredible expertise in this area, to give their thoughts for the record. And after that, anyone in the audience who would like to speak, please use the hand raise function to just make sure that we are aware that you want to speak. We do have two people who have indicated they want to speak, Ian Palmbaum and Emiliano Falcon. Forgot the rest of your name. And I believe Paul Warren will probably want to speak too. So we'll take those three, and then anyone else can raise their hand and give their thoughts to this issue. So let's start off with members of the committee. Does anyone like to start off with their thoughts, their concerns? Wait, who's going to raise their hand first?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay. Okay, Salvatore.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is that we take the time to do this properly. With any deployment of new technology, there are considerations, and I think we laid some of those out here. I think there'll be more of them as we get into the deployment of it as well. And my interest is, as we go through this process, because we're fairly early in it, is that we adhere to best practices around both security and privacy in the use of the technology, and also make sure from the town's perspective and from a social perspective we're doing the right thing. And I get, again, we're mostly here to listen to people's thoughts on the subject, and happy to have the opportunity to do that as well. So thanks, Bernard.
Okay. Who else would like to speak from the committee? Is that Susan?
Yes.
Okay, Susan.
I'm a defensive.
Introduce yourself, by the way.
Yeah.
Previously is Salvatore D'Agostino, and I'm not.
Yeah.
Incredible.
As an introduction, I'm a security and privacy professional and entrepreneur, and I've been doing this for several decades, and happy to be involved with Brookline's considerations.
Okay, Susan, introduce yourself.
I'm Susan Howards. I'm a criminal defense attorney with a focus on domestic violence, and that is my concern. In general, I'm in favor of the cameras, but with some caveats and limitations. Are they going to be used in a domestic violence call? If people do not want to be recorded, can they be turned on? Can they be turned off? And how will they be used as evidence in a courtroom situation? Will they take the place of an excited utterance in certain situations? So those are just some of my concerns, but I think overall the committee has really examined this from the four corners and will continue to.
Great, thank you. Who else from the committee?
I certainly have several things to say. But
okay.
I wonder if we should hear from Paul or Casey first, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Scott Wilder.
I'm happy to go first. My name is Paul Campbell. I'm a police officer with the Brookline Police Department, and I'm a lieutenant currently assigned to the Office of Professional Responsibility. I've been a police officer for 22 years. I personally am in favor of body cameras. I do internal affairs. It would make my job simpler in a number of cases. I hope people have read the document that was uploaded. I think it identifies a number of issues that deserve consideration with regard to the policy that we choose to implement. It's a complicated topic, much more complicated than I think the casual observer may recognize. And I'm really interested to hear what the members of the community think, what their concerns are, and what it is that what it is that makes them encouraged about body cameras.
Okay, great.
I can just echo what Lieutenant Campbell has said. I'm Casey Hatchett. I am on this committee actually as a resident of the town of Brookline, appointed member, but I also am a police officer with the Brookline Police Department and do support the implementation of body cameras for our department. It is a very complicated topic. Thanks to Susan and Amy who have brought forward some issues that I was not thinking about, and I appreciate that and look forward to our continued work on working through some of the privacy concerns as well as protections that these cameras will bring. So, and thank you for members of the public for coming out tonight.
Thank you. Scott Wilder, what do you have to say?
Thank you, sir. Good evening. I'm Scott Wilder, police officer, Brookline. Been on the job for 36 years, a few more than Paul Campbell, I guess, maybe one or two. I'm the director of technology for the police department. I think this is the technology piece, the infrastructure, the whole overall program is sort of where I come in, being the one that would be working to get this off the ground. So I'm sort of looking at it as the technology end, but also about 6 years ago, I was on a working group, a technology working group for the National Institute of Justice, and I reviewed probably about a dozen of the grants that were out there for body-worn cameras from some of the largest cities west of the Mississippi, and I can tell you there was back then, especially, it was departments were just going, the money was there, they were going to get body cameras. They didn't really do a lot of homework on what they were looking at. They were sort of like, okay, it's free, we've got to get it, this is our time to get it. They went out, and again, when you don't do your homework, like this committee is doing, this committee is looking into a lot of different angles. I'm very, very impressed with everyone's feelings as far as whether they're pro camera or not pro camera. I'm just sort of okay, if it comes, I have to make it work. If it doesn't come, then I'm on to other things. But it's really important that we go through this. Like I said, departments that didn't explore and didn't do their homework, it didn't really turn out to be all that good. They basically had to go back and reinvent the wheel and try and get it to the point where we're going to have it. If we get it right out of the box, I think we'll be in very good shape.
Amy, you want to speak?
Yes. It probably doesn't come to a surprise to a lot of people on this call that I am generally suspect of camera use for privacy reasons and privacy concerns that I have. My general view with body cameras is that, I think people want to implement them for good reasons, but there are these just across the board knee-jerk reason that they feel like it'll make everybody safe all of a sudden and make everything clear and easy. And I think nothing is further from the truth. I think if anything, it will become possibly more muddled and more fraught, but just in different ways and possibly complicate things. At its heart, these cameras will absolutely 100% increase surveillance in town at eye level, right? Body
140 plus cameras walking through town collecting data. And I think that's something the community has to consider just on its face alone, even if it were very cut and dried and simple. There are no guarantees that if we do implement this, that it will bring about the kind of policing reform that I think a lot of people are looking for. I think that, you know, it was interesting hearing earlier in the evening, we had a meeting before we had this hearing that, you know, one caution amongst the police is that they want to use it, you know, they don't want it to be micromanaged in a way, but I think in somehow that is how town meeting, at least, or some of the people voting this up or down or thinking about it, or thinking about policing, you know, better management in police that way. And so there's definitely a tension between how to use it. I think if it could potentially, the footage, be used disproportionately for prosecution as opposed to police oversight, which I think the majority of people who would vote for this are looking for. So that's a concern. Susan mentioned the issues around footage after rapes and domestic violence, what that captures, what happens to that. Vulnerable populations captured in a way that may worry some of us, you know, certainly immigrants that may be caught or may not want to interact with the police, knowing that they're being recorded and that their images are being captured. And those images are open, you know, to public records laws. So we, regardless of how good our policies are, that footage will be available to you know, people outside of Brookline, should they, such as ICE, should they want to view it. So that's something I think we need to consider. There are a few other concerns, but I think those are the big ones. I think it's going to cost us more than we think it may. We need to keep an eye on that. But I do appreciate the fact that the committee as a whole is looking at this with, I think, with a very balanced view, which is healthy, and that should they come to fruition, that we have a very strong policy and we do look at the small sides so that we have as much control and get the benefits out of it that everyone hopes for and expects.
Scott Ananian, you have anything to add to this? I know you're a major part of putting together this document.
I'll briefly summarize the sort of policy issues that I think were raised. So I'm Scott Ananian. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 10. The surveillance committee is as the outcome of a warrant article I filed back in 2016, I think, looking at the use of cameras in town. So I'm certainly pleased that the committee exists and has such expertise to bear on this issue. First thing about body-worn cameras is that I think they can be a positive force, but that the actual details of the body camera policy requires very careful and deliberate crafting. If sort of deployed heedlessly, they can cause a great deal of harm, as well as Amy, I think, has made a strong case for. But in more fundamental ways, you know, if you imagine that body-worn cameras are a way to sort of get to the truth and to allow civilians to level the playing field between in civilian-police interactions in cases of abuse or whatnot, that's by no means assured by the policy. They could just as easily be used in the other way to you know, with selective release of footage and used as a vehicle for sort of asserting power, right? The ones who have the footage is the police department, and so we've seen both sides of that play out. And so my concern is I want to make sure that our police department, if we deploy body cameras, does so in an equitable way, where they're sort of improving both the way that our officers can perform their duties, and to provide more justice in cases of alleged misconduct or malfeasance, that we can actually that both sides of any dispute can see this as a fair tool that helps us get to the truth. So I among the work that I've done to date has been doing a fairly careful comparison between the ACLU, the various ACLU model policies for body camera use, and other examples that we have in nearby cities and towns, including the city of Boston. And without getting into all the details, I'll mention that there's sort of 6 main issues which I think need careful consideration when we, if and when we draw up our policy for Brookline. The first 2 are somewhat obvious, but policy for activation when the cameras should be turned on, whether it's any encounter or only certain types of encounters. And as Officer Wilder has pointed out from the technology side, there's a variety of technical triggers that can be used these days too. The cameras can be enabled when the blue lights in the cruiser are turned on, or when an officer's firearm is removed from the holster. So all those things need to be paid careful attention to. And the second item is the converse of that, when the camera should be turned off and under what circumstances. When you're going to a person's private home and they've requested it, when it's a case of domestic violence, or a person seeking to anonymously report a crime. The Boston policy, I think, also contains some useful officer-officer interactions, improper recording during breaks or during non-work related personal activity or departmental meetings, things like that. And then there are the third category are technical issues related to the camera system. And these can get very technical, but pre-buffering, how much is recorded before the cameras are activated, which is a useful feature. How equipment failure is handled, placement of the camera on the uniform, the procedures at the start and end of the shift. Are they recorded? Is the footage uploaded wirelessly or only when they get back to the precinct? And Officer Wilder has cautioned that a lot of these details tend to depend very particularly on the details of the particular camera system acquired, so they'll require careful attention. And then the fourth big category is consequences of improper activation and deactivation. What happens when the cameras are misused, either intentionally or accidentally? Is this a disciplinary action or evidentiary consequences that improperly obtained footage can't be used? Which leads to item 5. I'm trying to go through these very quickly. Footage, custody, retention, and access. Who ultimately has custody of the footage, and what can it be used for? Is it a tool that can sort of be used only by one side, or revealed only by one side, or is it held in escrow, and how does that work? Are there different categories of retention for footage which is more or less sensitive? And then finally, automated analysis, which includes facial recognition. What sorts of uses of the data outside a particular incident can be used? Can this be used to look for patterns in certain behavior or patterns in crime? Can you run facial recognition on it, and these sorts of questions? So I think those are the 6 areas that I think are really important in terms of the wrong wording on any of those 6, I think would cause me to drop support for body cameras, right? So I think those are the details that I think we need to pay careful attention to if and as we deploy cameras.
Thank you. Before we open up to the public, I just want to make one key point. An important principle in Brookline, and one of the themes of both the considerations report as well as the work of the committee, is the idea that privacy and public security is very important. Civil liberties, civil rights is very important. In our considerations document, there is a discussion of that, and there's a link to a document prepared by one of our members, Salvador D'Agostino, on the connection between privacy and security. And I suggest that people review that because the point that we make in our committee's deliberation is that privacy and security are inseparable. And that principle applies to body-worn cameras. They should not compromise the privacy or the civil liberties of the public. And by protecting those privacy interests and civil liberties interests, Brookline will help ensure that body-worn cameras are effectively deployed for the benefit of the public and the police officers using them, and will have full support of the community. So I mean, that's a principle that we really emphasize in this committee, and I urge people to go to that link that's listed in footnote 6 of the document. So let's start off with Ian Pallenbaum asked to speak. All right, Ian, I think you're unmuted.
I am.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Hello, everybody. I recognize most of you. Good to see everyone. Ian Pallenbaum, Precinct 6 resident, former town meeting member, which of course means I know everything. I am a member of the still active, although somewhat relegated, Camera Oversight Committee. And also, just for identification purposes, I've been an assistant district attorney in Suffolk and Boston for the last 22 years. You know, if my words are quoted, it should be made clear that I'm speaking in my personal and town capacity rather than as a representative of the DA's office. But of course, my professional experience informs my views. Also means I bring a certain amount of bias, although if you think that just makes me in the tank for the police, then go to Boston and talk to the cops. Most of them think I'm a left-wing maniac. In terms of that experience, and I have kind of amended my comments to try to address a couple of the concerns that Susan and Amy and Scott expressed. And it's not to dismiss or belittle any of those concerns because they're important. This is our community, our money, our police department, people's rights. I can say from practical experience so far, and it hasn't been long, I've only seen an upside to police in Boston using the body cameras. It's certainly not always pretty. You see people at their worst moments. You see victims in crisis. You see people accused of crimes who are being handcuffed and arrested, sometimes roughly, and hauled away, and people across the board may be acting very differently from the way they may present in court later on. You also see and hear police, sometimes doing their jobs at their best and sometimes not so much. You don't need me to tell you that. Most of you, I'm sure, have seen the footage that was released on the fatal shooting on Route 9, for instance. No matter what you think of the conclusions about that shooting, there's some ugly stuff on there. But even though there's some ugly stuff on that footage, I doubt there are too many people who would say it's a bad thing that body cams were activated during that encounter. In fact, many more people would say it's too bad that more body cams weren't activated or for longer, and that the footage could have filled in some more gaps in what happened one way or another. Personally, I feel the same way when I look forward to the body cam footage in a Boston case and what it might show, only to find that an officer who actually did something important during that response was on an overtime shift or was working in a specialized unit and therefore not using a body camera at the time. And the reaction is never relief, it's usually disappointment. It is interesting, and I think very good that this committee has identified in that working document some contrasts between, for instance, the Boston policy and the ACLU model policy. And I certainly don't presume to recommend, what elements of which could be used for Brookline procedures. But I mean, I think the concept of what needs to be in there seems to be agreed on, which is there are certain requirements for when something is presumptively required to be recorded on a body camera. Broadly speaking, encounters with the public, obviously with certain exceptions. And then both things that are required not to be recorded, such as not public encounters, internal police things, things involving sensitive witnesses or informants or investigations, and then a lot of discretionary areas where officers make the decision whether to turn it on or off. And there's a section 2.4 of the Boston policy, which is pretty broad. Doesn't specifically mention domestic violence or sexually assault, but it's pretty well understood that that's among the sensitive situations, whether it's in someone's home or not, that's covered. What Susan said specifically about domestic violence and sexual assault situations, where an officer can deactivate the camera if the person who's reporting the crime, particularly if they're in their house, but not exclusively, doesn't want to be recorded. I have to say that experience so far is that it is not very often that somebody who has called the police for help then asks not to be recorded. My personal reaction has also been to favor keeping the cameras on unless the victim objects, or unless it involves children or something else like that. And it's not simply from a pure prosecution, use it as powerful evidence point of view, although, like I said, I have that bias. It's also simply, it's the best indication of what somebody says at the time when things are fresh, how they say it, and how they're affected by it, what their demeanor is. And it may seem insensitive to say we should, the police should be recording people at a time like sensitive time like that. I don't think we should make any assumptions one way or another about how a survivor of this kind of crime would necessarily react to that. It's embarrassing. Nobody likes to be recorded. I mean, you can see that I'm hiding the true background of the room I'm in, just an impulse. But viewing it as insensitive or exploitive is, you can see that in a different light if later on somebody is questioning the veracity and the validity of that victim's account and that victim's feelings. Questioning in the clear light of hindsight, particularly in a courtroom, was that person really hurt? Was that person really afraid? Was that person really telling the truth to the best of their ability? And then you go back to the best evidence of what was going on with them at the time. That brings me to some of the other objections that I've seen and heard to this. And I'd have to start with the idea that an unintended consequence or a bad consequence of the body cameras would be that they'd end up being used so much for prosecution. I have to say that seems like an awfully cynical reason not to use them. That, don't use something that can help show what really happened, that can help determine whether a prosecution brought by somebody like me gets it right and gets the evidence accurately. Of course, the video can be cherry-picked. And one concern about, Scott, you brought up a concern about selective release. The solution to the selective release problem is to say you can't do that. The solution to the selective release problem is to say you can't distort it by only releasing the parts of a video that favor one side or the other. And I know the concern is the police department only releasing video that makes the police look good or matches something in a police report. Well, if that's frowned upon, it won't get very far. And you've seen what happens, for instance, in that Kentucky shooting investigation where there was only a very selective release of what happened in the grand jury. And when more information came out, it didn't reflect very well on the people who selectively release things. I would also point out, and I'm sure Susan appreciates this as well as a defense attorney, is that the video, once it's in a criminal case, is equally available and potentially useful to a criminal defendant, to somebody accused of a crime. It's one more way that somebody accused of a crime can test the evidence and see what's there. It shows the police and civilian interactions. If an officer says that somebody made admissions to a crime or other incriminating statements or behavior when they got there, if the camera is on, then either those statements will be on there the way the officer said they were made, or it won't. If an officer says somebody resisted arrest, and the arrest is captured on one or more body cameras, then people will be able to make a more informed judgment about what actually happened. We've also heard, and it was a little disconcerting to see this listed just as, ticked off among the negatives. The idea that maybe people should rethink body cameras because even though they're supposed to keep an eye on police misconduct, they could also be used to exonerate the police. That also sounds cynical, as long as there's not the opportunity to cherry pick and withhold certain evidence and release others. Sorting out any disputed event is only helped by more exposure and more information, not less. Regarding the privacy and civil liberties concerns, and again, it's hard to talk about these and favor these surveillance technologies without being accused of belittling the civil liberties concerns. On the camera committee, we've been accused of that and pushed back. I would only say that on balance, I'd suggest two things. One is that it's a tool that shows the government in action, and it shows the actions and interactions of government agents who have guns and badges and very formidable powers to confine people and even to kill people. More information about that and more light on that can't be a bad thing. I understand these surveillance concerns. I would suggest that a body camera on the front of a uniformed officer coming at you is pretty unwieldy as a surveillance tool, just aimed generally back at the population, walking around town, picking up data to be assembled later, especially if the camera is not supposed to be activated just when an officer's driving down the street or walking down the street and just taking things in. It's supposed to be activated when you're actually having an interaction with a civilian that should be recorded. I trust that any policy that Brookline enacts, there will be a prohibition on using cameras for that purpose or for the purpose of surveilling a crowd to go back later and see who's there or to pick up what political speech is being expressed, or on using them in private spaces. And when I say private, that includes things like churches and schools, unless it's during an active police response that needs to be documented, or on using them for any private agenda, such as a police officer wants to follow and get information on an estranged spouse or on somebody they just don't like and want to get evidence on. Or of course, a prohibition on using them surreptitiously. It's a felony in Massachusetts for anybody, including a police officer, to record somebody's spoken communications without their knowledge. Police officers are also supposed to inform the people being recorded that they're being recorded. And instances, if the officers neglect to actually inform somebody that they're being recorded, that failure to inform them is also recorded. If the body camera is on, it's recorded by its absence. Officer, I didn't hear you tell this person that you were recording them. Again, and specifically, Susan, regarding the domestic violence concerns, you had a question about whether things recorded on a body camera would replace the excited utterance. Just in case anybody needs that background, excited utterance is a hearsay exception. It means that somebody else can testify about what you said at the time without you testifying to it. If you were still under the influence of the exciting or upsetting event and you were sufficiently agitated by it, that your statement is considered more reliable because you didn't have time to calm down and think about it and reflect and possibly fabricate. And that's exception's been kind of whittled down by the courts over the years, but that's the basics of it. And it is a frequent tool in domestic violence prosecutions and in any prosecution. If somebody is visibly upset or audibly upset and is saying so-and-so did something to me, that statement's likely to come in for court. And the answer, Susan, is it wouldn't be that it would replace an excited utterance. It would be that it is the excited utterance, and that it is even more reliable in terms of a possible excited utterance than an officer getting on a witness stand and saying, I saw so-and-so who was visibly upset and told me X, Y, and Z. And the reason is that the judge and then ultimately the jury can look at that actual video and make a determination. Was this person under the stressful influence of what had happened at the time they made their statement, so they could consider it, so the court can consider it more reliable. I have yet to encounter a situation where a survivor in a case who was recorded at a time in crisis has come back to us later and said, that's bad that I was recorded, that shouldn't have happened. I'm not saying that nobody feels that way. I'm not saying it won't happen, because I'm sure it will, because people have all kinds of different reactions to traumatic situations. I can only tell you, to the extent it informs this committee, that to date, in my own experience and what I know of, it hasn't happened. Regarding public records, I know it would take some tweaking of the regulations. It might even take some tweaking of legislation. Right now, there is a privacy law that basically says court records that identify a victim of sexual assault and domestic violence either have to be withheld from public inspection or redacted so the names aren't in there. And police reports in the custody of a police department having to do with sexual assault or domestic violence are not public records. So it seems to me, and I can't claim to be an expert on the state of the law on this regarding video footage, but it seems to me that body camera footage that essentially identifies the victim of a sexual assault or domestic violence by showing them would not be something that would be releasable under a public records request. Of course, it would become public record if it were admitted as evidence in a court proceeding, such as a trial or a motion hearing. But up to that point, I think there are ways to protect that information. So I know I've gone on far longer than the few minutes.
And I let you do that.
Usually have, and I'm grateful, Mr. Green and everybody else, for giving me that time, and I hope this has been constructive for you.
Thank you. Can I just add that with respect to domestic violence footage, you can go online and find videos of police incidents all over the place. Anyway, okay, next, Emiliano. And by the way, let me just add, I should have added this at the beginning. We are recording this and we're going to try to put together a transcript. So just be aware that we're recording. And if you would like to submit written information to us, we would appreciate that. It will become part of the record in addition to the transcript. So Emiliano.
Yes, thank you, Bernard. Hello, hi all. Good evening. My name is Emiliano Falcon-Morano. I am the Policy Counsel for the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. On behalf of the ACLU and our members and supporters in Brookline, I submit this testimony to provide some brief comments about the body-worn cameras. So the ACLU of Massachusetts, as you may know, does not take an official position on whether cities and towns should implement a body-worn camera program. However, if cities and towns collectively decide to do it, we recommend body-worn cameras to be implemented with the right policies and procedures in place. To that end, today when I will submit my written testimony, I will attach our model policy, which was mentioned today. We have a model policy. We are going to attach it to our testimony. And overall, we think that the use of body-worn cameras can provide oversight and accountability only if done right. First, Video footage from body-worn cameras provides the public with crucial information and serves to protect people on both sides of the badge. These videos have been especially important when there have been allegations of police misconduct. For example, when a Milwaukee police officer arrested the NBA player Sterling Brown, footage of the arrest showed police officers acting inappropriately. Thanks to the public dissemination of the footage, the officers were disciplined for violating Mr. Brown's civil rights. In a Texas case, body cameras played a crucial role in the conviction of a police officer who killed an unarmed African-American teenager. Second, body-worn cameras can also help judges better evaluate claims made both by defendants and law enforcement in court. In Boston, police officers have found that the footage protects their members well, and I quote, that protects their members well is the quote, sorry. While defense attorneys have won motions to dismiss criminal cases based on body-worn camera footage that contradicts police testimony. When evaluating these possible uses, one of the key issues to consider is that the footage derived from body-worn cameras must be available to the public. Public accessibility to video footage is crucial for the reaping of the social benefits of allowing body-worn cameras. If body-worn cameras will effectively fulfill an accountability function, the video footage must be subject to public inspection. Otherwise, body-worn cameras would simply become another surveillance technology in the hands of the government. Finally, body-worn cameras can be useful tool in preserving evidence of police misconduct, providing greater oversight, and increasing the accountability of police officers. But like any policing technology, body-worn cameras have a high potential for abuse. Without proper protocols and strict practices, body-worn cameras can be another surveillance tool with a disproportionate impact on over-policed minority communities. A key police requirement to ensure body-worn cameras facilitate police accountability is a prohibition against police officials reviewing body-worn camera footage before writing incident reports. That way, the public can be sure that officers do not craft their statement in line with what can and cannot be viewed in the footage. Thank you for your public service and your commitment to the people of Brookline. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me get something down you wrote, you mentioned. Okay, next, Mr. Warren, did you want to speak?
Yes, thank you, Bernard. My comments will be very brief. First, I want to thank the committee for their work on this, and I really appreciate the summary document that you sent out that gave a broad surveillance, pardon the pun, of the issues that need to be considered. You know, I have three issues that I wanted to talk about. Two very briefly. First, I agree with all the privacy issues. I'm very concerned about that. I don't have an opinion one way or the other at this point, but I am concerned about privacy. Surveillance is a significant issue for all the reasons that you mentioned, domestic violence and others. And I think that it's something that we really need to focus on. I'm also concerned about costs. I saw some numbers projected in the document. You know, I have a 35-year background in technology as a former CIO, and you know, cost is certainly an important consideration. This is not cheap technology. It will change quickly, and whether it's retention locally on servers or it's up in the cloud, there's a lot of implications, and you know, that type of spend on our budget versus need and impact, I think it's something that we do need to consider. But really the issue that I'd like to focus on, and I haven't heard much about, is really the impact on community relations. You know, technology has been transformative throughout our society. You know, from automobiles and manufacturing to social media, medical, everything. It has been helpful in some cases, very disruptive, and sometimes very destructive in its application. And, you know, when I was a kid, I used to go to work with my father in Inman Square, and he was a busy pharmacist, and I was a young kid, and I didn't want to sit in the pharmacy all day. And I would go walk the beat with Joe the cop. And, you know, I had a relationship with him. And he looked out for me, and I didn't realize at the time, but he's kind of taking care of me. And it was a relationship. And I really worry about the impact that body cameras or any technology with respect to police enforcement, police cameras, et cetera, in cars, could potentially have on the relationship with the community. Public safety is a relationship. It's preventative when it's a relationship. And the potential for body cameras to change the nature of that relationship, to change the balance of it, is concerning to me. I don't know the answer, but I am concerned about it. I'm concerned that some individuals in our community that have been concerned about the policing in Brookline may not approach a police officer proactively if there's a concern about being recorded. I worry that there may be situations where younger people in our community that once the trust is broken, that there's a recording, either intentionally or unintentionally. Once the word gets out that you are to avoid that thing that's on the uniform, I really do worry about the impact in our community. And for policing in Brookline to be effective, there has to be a relationship. There has to be a trusting relationship. And technology has been known to disrupt significantly relationships between two parties. And I do worry and am concerned about how this technology will disrupt the relationship between Brookline citizens and residents and visitors and our law enforcement. So that would be the area that I hope that we talk more about. I think you've covered everything else really well, and I really do appreciate your service to our community. And there's many experts on this board, and we just heard a community member speak passionately about the legal side of it, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness on it. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So I see John Van Scoyoc, who's a member of the select board, is in the meeting. John, would you like to add anything? You have any thoughts? No need if you don't. No? Okay. Well, there you are.
You're asking me.
Pardon me?
I heard you say John. I didn't know if you were referring to me.
You're breaking up. Yes, I was referring to you, John Van Scoyoc. If you had anything to add, you could add it.
No, I'm just listening, but thank you for asking.
Okay. Abby Patkin from the TAB is also on. I'm not sure if I should ask her if she has any questions, but I guess if she does, you can ask them, Abby. All set for now. We appreciate your attending this meeting, Abby. So before we close out, do select board members have any, the committee members have anything else to add? I would like to say before that, though, that this hearing is being broadcast over the BIG YouTube network. So there may be people watching us on YouTube who may have comments. And if you do, please submit those comments to the committee via the select board address that you can find on our website. I should know it, but I don't. We'll include them in the record, or you can send them to any one of us, and we'll incorporate them into the record. So any closing comments, observations by members of the committee? I see Amy raised her hand. Yeah.
I did raise my hand. So I stand by my comments and a few more, but I'll be making some of those remarks at town meeting as well around this. But one thing I did want to point out to the community who may be listening, or anybody who's on the call, is that in the document, I think, Bernard, you kept the link inserted about, I think the heading is "What You See Isn't Always What You Get." And it's a link to a New York Times article. It's not really an article. It's got a couple of video clips in it, meant to underscore the fact that sometimes what you see, you know, it doesn't always tell the whole story. And this idea that this is complicated, that the, you know, that it won't necessarily, it's not a panacea, which is one reason the ACLU doesn't take a position on it, because it is fraught with issues. And so looking at some of those videos, you don't have to answer the questions in order to just click on the links, and it's very short, but it's worth looking at. It's instructive.
Right, but and it also sort of raises in this context questions that have been raised for years with respect to a cell phone video or other video taken by individuals in the street, and you know how juries can look at, you know, what seems obvious to one person as showing something different to another person. So I mean, it's not a new problem. So, but those videos are very helpful. Any other comments?
I just wanted to thank Ian for his comments. I actually participated as a fly on the wall in some of the Boston hearings that led to their policy, and as you pointed out, I think you know, it is possible to construct a good body camera policy, but all those decisions were deliberate choices. A number of the things that you outlined, for example, the selective release, right? The fact that the policy needs to contain provisions that prevent selective release. You know, it's I think I'll say I look forward to a careful process in Brookline. One of the things that I thought was remarkable about the Boston pilot and eventual policy was that they involved community members from the beginning, and so there was community pushback from the start. For example, in the initial pilot plan for the Boston body-worn cameras was felt to unfairly target minority areas. I think I don't remember the exact details, but we'll say for the sake of argument that the initial idea was that the cameras would be deployed to high crime areas, and that turned out to levy the burden of surveillance mostly on minority populations. And so that was a discussion, a pushback from the community that resulted in an altering of the terms of the pilot. So I hope that we can have a similarly successful sort of community joint process in constructing a policy that will serve the needs of our town. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Ian, did you raise your hand?
No. I was just acknowledging Scott.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay, so let's close this hearing. I think it was very useful, and you know the materials we circulated plus the contributions from the public will go into a record that I think will be incredibly useful as we consider body-worn cameras here in Brookline. So thank you, everyone, and good night.